In this video, we're going to tackle this problem, the good old iPhone SE. As you build more involved, bigger apps, this screen size is going to become like the bane of your existence. Luckily, I think in the next year or two, we should start to see it phase out because the next generation iPhone SE allegedly is going to be in the iPhone 8 body style, not this screen size. So hopefully we don't have to deal with this for too much longer, but for now we do, and it's always a pain in the butt. And looking at this design, I remember when designing it, I strategically designed it so the iPhone SE wouldn't be a huge issue, right? That's why there was only 2 cards. However, what I didn't account for, and again, I want to keep sharing this stuff so you see some of the hurdles that, developers run into when designing an app. But looking at the screenshot, right, what I didn't account for when I designed the screen to make it fit on the iPhone 5 screen size was the nav bar at the top. That pushes everything down a little bit. And then also on iOS 13, this card format, look how much spacing at the top of the screen we're losing. So when you put that little card format at the very top, as well as the navigation controller, look where the top of the avatar image view starts. We're losing 10 to 15% of our screen height. So I didn't account for that, and that's why this is messed up. But we're going to fix it. Now, we're also going to talk through the thought process of fixing this because I've seen in the comments a lot of people have trouble dealing with the iPhone SE. So my initial thought was to do something similar to what we did with the login screen. If you remember the login screen, all we had to do was adjust the top of the GitHub logo image, move it up to the top more. That moved everything up. We were good to go there. And for that, we conditionally set constraints, based on is it iPhone SE or not. Well, my first take on this screen, the user info screen, I started with that approach. And looking at this screen, I was like, okay, where can I save space? And I started looking okay, cool. I could, make the bio label smaller. I can, decrease the spacing between the cards. Maybe for the iPhone SE, I could make the button thinner, not, I believe it's 50 height or 44, but I could make it thinner and then make the cards height smaller. What it really boiled down to as I was digging into that approach was, it was getting ridiculous, right? I was like, man, I'm going to have to conditionally set 20 different constraints. 20 is probably a high number, but it was a lot. It wasn't like, hey, change one constraint and you're good to go. And anytime when I start doing something, I have that voice in the back of my head, all right, this is getting silly or this is getting ridiculous. I immediately start to think of okay, maybe I'm going down the wrong path. Is there another solution that may be better or just as good? And when it comes to the iPhone SE, let's talk about this a little bit, because oftentimes these apps, when they're designed by the designer, they're designing with the iPhone X models and the iPhone 7 or 8 in mind. They're not really designing for this iPhone SE. So oftentimes, if you want to make it look as beautiful and elegant as it does on the larger screens, that's a lot of work to make it look that good on the iPhone SE. And I'm a believer in when it comes to the iPhone SE, make it passable, make it usable. Don't worry about making it amazing. And here's why, right? Because that's a lot of work to do that. And I'm going to share with you a nice resource here down on the internet. It's mixpanel.com/trends. I'll link to it in the description of the video. But if you scroll down, they have all kinds of different charts. We're going to go to iPhone models here. And if I click on it, you can see the current adoption of all the iPhone models. But we're just going to, you can scroll through time. You can see the timeline at the bottom. We're going to scroll to now, which is all the way to the right. And I'll just remove my head here. So if we're now, this is as of Monday, January 27th. So a couple days behind, but you get it. Actually, let me click on the iPhone SE down here. For some reason, it defaults is not even on there, but we can click on that. And then now if I move to the right, look at the iPhone SE at the bottom, 2.36% of iPhone models. So when it comes to your app, do you really want to do a ton of work for 2.36% of your user base? Now that question is not going to be the same for everybody. Let me get out of here, right? If you have a small app, 10,000 users, 50,000 users, 2.3%, that's not enough to really put in that much effort. If you're Facebook or YouTube, 2.3% of your user base is a ton of people, millions of people. So in that case, it is going to be worth the effort to make it look good on the iPhone SE. So again, this is the nuance. It depends. Depends on how big your user base is, how much effort you want to put into this. So back to me looking for other approaches, right? I went down the rabbit hole of trying to find space amongst all the items. That started to get ridiculous. So I looked for an alternative solution and I was like, you know what? Why don't we just throw it in a scroll view? And on the iPhone 5, the user can scroll up. I felt that was the simplest and just easiest solution to implement. Again, that was after moving elements became ridiculous. So that's why, back to the search screen, when all we had to do was move one element up. In that case, I'm not doing a scroll view. I'm just going to move that element up and be good. In the case of the user info screen, the scroll view ended up being the better answer. And here you're going to see the power of doing things programmatically. I actually find this scroll view relatively simple. Whoops, we're on the wrong screen. User info screen. Relatively simple to implement when it comes to programmatically. So let's do this. We'll talk more about that in a bit. So let scroll view equal UI scroll view right there. And we can delete that. We don't need that extra space there. And then now here we're going to create a new function called configure scroll view, very similar to how we've been creating all of our other objects. So func configure scroll view. And of course, the first thing we need to do is view.add subview scroll view. Now, the thing with scroll views is when you're dealing with a screen like ours, all of our UI elements, like the cards, the user header info, VC, all that stuff, that needs to go into a content view. That just doesn't go right into the scroll view. So we need to add that content view here. So let content view equal UI view. And then now that we have these two, I'm gonna create like a logical visual space in between them, because this is like our scroll view content view, and then this is like all the stuff that goes in it. So back down to our configure scroll view. The content view actually goes inside the scroll view. If you've ever built a scroll view on Storyboard, maybe you're familiar with that. You drag the scroll view on, you pin it to the edges, then you drag the content view, drop it inside the scroll view. That's essentially what we're doing just programmatically. So we've already added our scroll view to the view. Now we want to do scroll view dot add subview content view, right? We're adding the content view to that scroll view. And then now we're just going to do the typical constraint stuff here. So scroll view dot tamic, right, equals false. Content view dot tamic equals false. Okay, so now we need to constrain these two items. NS layout constraint dot activate. Again, very similar to what we've been doing. And the scroll view is just going to get pinned to the edge here. So if we do scroll view dot top anchor dot constraint equal to view.top anchor. Oh, no constant. We don't need a constant. We're just pinning it to that. Comma. We're actually going to create an extension to do this here too. So we'll get back to that in a second. Scroll view dot leading anchor dot constraint equal to view dot leading. Again, hopefully this is super repetitive by now, right? We've done a ton of constraints in this course. So hopefully you get this stuff real quick. Equal to view.trailing, right? We're just pinning it to the edges of the view. Have it fill up the whole view. So scroll view dot bottom anchor dot constraint equal to view dot bottom anchor. So before we move on, we're actually going to add an extension to our UI view, because this is actually a pretty common constraint, right? Where you're just pinning it to the super view, right? Pinning it to the top, leading, bottom. You've probably done this a bunch. I usually have this extension in all my projects because you do this a lot. And if we go to our extensions here, well, let's copy and paste this first because we're going to need this here. Go to UI view.extension. So in here we can do func pin to edges and then of super view, and super view is going to be UI view. So the way this reads is we're gonna call like scroll view dot pin to edges of, and we pass in the super view. And again, this is a very common thing. So the first thing we want to do here when we're setting the constraints is tamic, right, equals false. And then now we need to set our constraints. So ns layout constraint dot activate. Again, same thing we've been doing. And this is what I copied and pasted. So we'll bring these constraints into here, except we're no longer on the scroll view. We're just in the extension of our UI view, so we don't need that. And then the view we're constraining to is the super view that we pass in. Again, we're going to call scroll view pin to edges of view. And you'll see we'll use this again as well. So do a Command B to make sure we got that. So this is, again, this is an extension I bring into like almost every project, because pinning to the edges of a super view is a very common task. So now back to our UserInfoVC. So I no longer need to have all these constraints. And if you noticed, I no longer need to have the tamic because we set that. And we're going to do the content view here in a second. So I'm going to do scroll view, like I said, dot pin to edges of view, right? It's the view. So that's just a quick and easy way to kind of get all that logic out of the view controller and just do that. Now we want to pin the content view. So content view dot pin to edges of, not the view. We want to pin the content view to the scroll view. Right? Remember we said you drop the scroll view on the storyboard and then you put the content view inside the scroll view. It's exactly what we're doing here. So we've pinned the content view to the edges of the scroll view. If you remember earlier in the course, I said a good rule of thumb for constraints is that you're always going to have 4 constraints. If you have more than 4 constraints, you're probably wrong. this is one of those exceptions. With the scroll view, it needs to know an explicit width and height. I'm sorry, the content view needs to know an explicit width and height, even though you've pinned it to the edges. And this is just kind of one of the quirks of a scroll view. So content view dot width anchor. Well, I need to do my NS layout constraints. Almost forgot about that. So NS layout constraint dot activate, and then we're passing in an array, and it's going to be content view dot width anchor dot constraint. It's going to be equal to, I gotta go down a bit for this one, right? Equal to, I don't know why they keep moving around in the autocomplete. That's weird. Equal to scroll view dot width anchor. Right, we're giving that explicit width, and then content view dot height. Here's the tricky part. Not tricky, but here's the interesting thing. So height anchor dot constraint is equal to, we're going to put in 600, and I've dialed this number in, and this is basically how tall this is going to be. Actually, you know what? Let's call this 2000 for now, just so you can see. I can illustrate what's going on. And again, I need the comma here. So what we've done here, am I calling configure scroll view? No, I'm not. Configure scroll view. So what's going on here? Just to reiterate, we're adding the scroll view to the view. We're adding the content view to the scroll view. We're pinning the scroll view to the edges of the view, pinning the content view to the edge of the scroll view. And then we got to add these two extra constraints to give it an explicit width and height. You'll see why. But now pulling up our design again, now we have our, content view and scroll view, all these elements, right? The header VC, the card VCs, item info VCs, that no longer needs to be in the view. That needs to be inside our scroll view. Now, this is the beauty of programmatic UI. Like, can you imagine doing this on Storyboard when you have this screen all laid out in Storyboard, and now you got to add a scroll view to that? You're just going to be like, and you're dragging views around on the storyboard. It would be a nightmare. Like, I don't even want to think about it. But this, again, is the power of programmatic UI. Watch how easy it is to add all this stuff to the scroll view. If we go down to our layout UI function, we've done. And remember, we were doing this. We have all of our header view, item view 1, item view 2, date label, all that stuff. Now we want this in the scroll view. So instead of here in our for loop where we're iterating through all this stuff, instead of view.addSubView, we do content view.addSubView. Now all that stuff is immediately in the content view. And then again, when it comes to our constraints, it's no longer view. We're just going to copy content view here. So I can paste it here, paste it here. So, and then paste it here in the view. Again, I know you can do replace all in scope. I get that. I'm just in the habit of doing it this way. And to me, it's like actually probably quicker to do it this way. We've replaced all of our views with content view. So just like that took me like 4 seconds to basically throw everything into the scroll view. And again, can you imagine on Storyboard dragging all those views around? Like, that would be a nightmare. I don't even want to think about it. So now let's test our scroll view, and it's going to look weird scrolling back up because we're setting our height to 2000, but I'm doing that to illustrate a point. So let's run this on the iPhone SE. Let's get to a user here. Get followers. Tap a random user. Cool. Now you can see we're scrolling. And the reason I made it 2000, look how far down we're going. That's because our height is 2000. Like, we've explicitly set the height. And we can explicitly set the height because like our UI is not dynamic, right? There's no like new card sliding in that will keep, adding to this and making this longer, like, right? So we know, and again, I've dialed in 600 to be like a good height. Like, this is what 2000 gets us, all this space at the bottom, right? That's obviously way too much. So again, I dialed it in to get 600. So now let's change that to 600, run it again, test it out. I should be doing this instead of like typing. Whoop, I have no favorites. Okay. I guess we got to type out the name. Click on a user. Okay, now when you scroll, see now 600 gets us to here. And that looks good. That's about as far as we want to go down. I don't know, maybe you could argue GitHub profile is a little close to the bottom. Maybe you could argue like 610, 620. We're splitting hairs here. Do what you like. But the scroll view is implemented, and that's how we're handling this on the iPhone SE. And again, I felt this was a much simpler solution than trying to make things smaller, minimize spaces. Like, that was just getting ridiculous. Throwing it into scroll view, and you saw how relatively easy it is, right? I find scroll views to be a pain on Storyboard. And you can see we just, added it programmatically, set some constraints real quick, and then threw all of our existing views into the content view just by switching out view into content view, and we were good to go. So that wraps up the video on fixing the iPhone SE. We threw a scroll view in there. Hopefully it was valuable hearing the thought process and how I tried one method. That got ridiculous, so I immediately switched to, okay, there's got to be a better answer. Landed on the scroll view. That ended up being much simpler, and I think even the more elegant solution. So I like to show the thought process, so hopefully that was valuable to you. On to the next video, which is going to be our final pass. Right? We've done one pass where we did a lot of work. We found a lot of bugs and made a lot of changes. That was one pass. Now we're going to do our final pass, before we get ready to turn in our project.